to try to problem solve. The challenge, of course, is that it's incomplete knowledge. We don't, in fact, know all of the things that we're ultimately going to need to know to solve the problems that we're trying to solve. And some of the things that we think we do know, we're actually going to turn out to be kind of wrong about. So, Agile practices allow us to embrace this uncertainty, to do the best we can at the beginning, to try to understand the nature of the problems we're trying to solve together, and then to put in place adaptive practices that allow us to learn, allow us to prioritize and reprioritize things as we get smarter about the problem or about the solution we're trying to build. I like to describe this because people often get confused about Agile. They think about agility as practice. We're Agile because we do stand-ups, or we're Agile because we have sprint planning meetings, right? There are many, many, many different practices in Scrum and extreme programming and Kanban and any of a number of other disciplines, but it's not really about practice, right? It's really about your point of view in how we solve problems. We're going to do the best we can to try to understand what we think we know, and then we're going to try to learn and adapt as we get smarter about things. So when you consider the Agile value propositions, we care about our individuals and facilitating effective interactions. We may use processes and tools to do that, but the processes and tools exist to support the people and to facilitate the work, right? We may, in fact, we want to prioritize working solutions. Doesn't mean we won't have any documentation. We'll certainly provide the documentation we need for the stakeholders that need it. But ultimately, it becomes much more a focus on, do we have a functioning working solution for the customer? We certainly will continue to have contracts, but we're going to need to be able to establish collaborative models so that we can learn and customers can learn as we work our way through time. And then, of course, we want to be adaptive. Not that we're not going to do plans, but the plans are kind of the best we can given the scope of view we have. And that as we learn, we're going to need to adapt accordingly. This leads to a very fundamental idea in Agile, that we want to prioritize what we think we want at any particular moment in time. Right? So when we are instantiating a backlog, we are defining a prioritization, not forever, but for the current moment, given what we know right now. Right? So in a typical Agile discipline, you have a product backlog managed by, if you're using something like Scrum, the product owner, the person who's ultimately responsible for herding all the different cats who have different interests in what the solution should look like and what kinds of capabilities and priorities they may have for different aspects of the solution. And that this is emergent and fungible, right? That we want to be able to generate a backlog at the beginning of our project journey because we're going to do the best we can to try to understand what we think we want. And we're also going to enter with a certain level of humility, that we don't, in fact, know all the things that we're going to know, and that we should be prepared to add, change, remove, reprioritize, or adapt that backlog as everybody along the journey gets smarter about what's needed, right? So an important part of this, we start talking about prioritization techniques, is to think about how and for whom this is useful, right? So it's not really the job of a delivery team to prioritize the project. Ultimately, we may have a facilitative role to help our customers and our stakeholders get their hands around their needs, to be able to identify and assess alternatives, and to make some trade-off decisions. But at the end of the day, the customer has to own their own prioritizations, and we in turn have an important role to play in helping to inform them about certain risks, about certain potential impacts, so that they can make appropriate and informed decisions about what should go first, second, and third. So while this is the responsibility ultimately of the customer, and whether that is customer is served by a product owner or in some other model, but that doesn't mean they're going to have clear understanding of how to do that. And so they're going to look to our supporting and delivery teams to help them, to help engage their users, their customers, their auditors, other stakeholders who have interests in the solution to be able to identify and prioritize options. And so at some point, it can be helpful to have some go-to techniques that you can use. So this afternoon, we're going to spend just a few minutes here looking at some options. There are a number of different techniques you can use. Many of them work very well. It is certainly my recommendation that your particular organization or your particular work teams pick a finite number of these that you can use consistently and repeatably so that your teams get some more experience with this and ultimately so that you end up being able to better carry out these practices and be able to help your customers prioritize their needs. So when you're creating a backlog, all right, we generally have stuff at the top of the backlog that's been very well refined. We've done a series of question and answers conversations with our product owner and probably other stakeholders. We've maybe taken some larger epics and decomposed those into more explicit user stories. We probably have a pretty good idea about what the acceptance criteria are going to look like. And then the further down the backlog we get, the bigger the rocks probably get. And we're probably not going to take the time to decompose a lot of those things until it gets a little closer in the mirror so that we're not spending time, for example, prioritizing and decomposing things that are low priority already, because those may ultimately end up getting displaced by other things that turn out to be higher value. Right. So we want to be able to help our clients build a functioning, working product backlog with nice refined things at the top, maybe some bigger rocks at the bottom, but that reflect the business's prioritization for value and the businesses and our team's issues related to risk. So when I'm teaching people how to write user stories, again, they're really basic skills, right? So they teach people in generic agile classes a template. As a role or stakeholder, I want to do something so that I get certain results that I want. Right. Importantly, of course, the whole idea of user stories is to shift the conversation from what the system is supposed to be to what the use and value is supposed to be. They're value-based statements. Many people use the acronym INVEST to help people get a temperature check on what makes good stories. And that's a quick because, of course, becomes important when we start thinking about prioritization. In particular, I want to call out the piece about valuable. Stories are supposed to deliver meaningful value to really, truly users, really people that are going to be doing work, carrying out transactions, delivering certain business results, certain business benefits, right? Not all requirements are morally equal. This is one of the big improvements, of course, that comes with an agile approach. In a traditional waterfall style project, there's often little or no differentiation among requirements. They're all treated very morally equally, right? And that's not how the real world works. In the real world, of course, we may have any number of different types of requirements, some of which are wildly more important than others. So we want to ensure that our stories reflect a value-based prioritization in what we try to do. So we're going to try to consider a number of key factors. These may encompass broad business factors. It's how many people are going to use this solution, whether this creates opportunities for us to serve new customers or to be able to serve existing customers in fundamentally new ways. Does this allow us new revenue and profit opportunities? Is it particularly important to certain critical customers of ours who are anchor customers and fundamental to our ability to achieve our broader organizational goals? And does it kind of work and play well with other things so that helps the business can naturally adopt these capabilities? There are certainly some technical considerations that should be at play here. How familiar are we with this? How much risk kind of gets born if we wait in terms of being able to take on certain challenges and prove that we can solve certain types of technical problems and come up with meaningful approaches? And does this potentially impact other systems or other value streams if the work gets deferred in certain ways? Right. So when we start engaging stakeholders to look at relevant prioritization issues, we certainly want to consider business factors first. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't inform our customers of some of the technical challenges associated with certain pieces of this and how that might affect our prioritization decisions. At this point, you start thinking about how much of the solution will we actually require in order to produce something that the customer can really use, right? If people are used to traditional project approaches, they're used to this notion that they don't get anything until they can get everything. Once they start adopting a value-based prioritization approach, on the other hand, now they can start to figure out some big truths. One of which is that about 20% of your solution is really about 90% of the value. And so if we can do a proper job of value-based prioritization, by the time we've delivered 20% of the solution, a meaningful subset of the value proposition is in place. And so we want to condition the customer to think a little differently. How little of the solution would nonetheless be so compelling in terms of new capabilities, new features, new functions, that the customer could start using it early, could start getting results early and driving real value to their organizations, and also driving better quality feedback to the teams. Because once we actually start really using it, one of the things that will happen is meaningful high value things will start to show up, many of which are not already in our backlog. And many of those will probably end up jumping the line because they're higher value. And by its very nature, this means we're going to produce much more high value solutions for our clients that not only meet their original goals, but better reflect the learning and adaptation that we can bring to the table as we start working our way through time and getting better feedback on what works and what else might be needed. So when you work with clients to help try to organize them, you may work together with them to help write stories, right? And if you run a user story writing workshop, your users may create a couple hundred different stories at some point along the way. Now, if your poor product owner has to try to prioritize these all by him or herself, it's not going to end well for them. They're going to end up being very frustrated, and they're going to often be very challenged to have enough level of visibility to be able to make informed decisions about what should go first, second, or third. So it's helpful as part of workshopping with these stakeholders to help them use one or maybe a combination of some of the techniques I'm about to show you. The first set of techniques broadly introduce a set of different matrices. And you can look at these in different combinations of things. There's what's called the Eisenhower matrix, which has been used for many years, which categorizes work as either urgent or not urgent, important or not important, right? Obviously, if something is urgent, something is critical and important, it's probably got to go first, right? We certainly don't want to crowd out important things that are less urgent, and we want to make sure that we're prioritizing those appropriately. We may have urgent things that are less important. Maybe we can find another way to deal with some of those that doesn't distract the team from the important activities. And then there may be things that are neither really terribly urgent or terribly important, and time in life is short. And we may decide together that it's not really appropriate to spend people and resources on those things. Likewise, you can do a similar type of approach with other different axes: high value, low value, high effort, low effort. Or you can look at value and risk, or you can look at value and complexity. right? And this will help you at a high level to categorize for a bunch of stories. Where do they relevantly fit? Are these high value things? Are they relatively low effort to do? Those might go first in the queue. We might actually look at high value things that are fairly high risk, and we might want to take those on first for the purpose of trying to attack those risks and be able to mitigate those away so that they don't compromise our project in fundamental ways later on. One of the most commonly used techniques, and this has been a go-to technique for product managers going back into even the 1980s and 1990s, is this model called the Kano Model. Right? In the Canoe Model, you're looking at a particular feature or function or capability in a broad context of what it really means in the business's context and from the perspective of certain critical stakeholders. Right? So you notice here that there are three curves. The red curve identifies to the top right what we call excitement factors. These might be fundamentally competitive differentiators. If we had this capability, other people don't have it. And maybe that would be a competitive reason why someone would choose my solution over somebody else's solution. On the left side of the red curve, we have what I infamously call the 27th cup holder. So imagine you're in an SUV that seats 6 people that has 26 cup holders. Right? So is there any marginal value in adding a 27th one? Or is it just extra? It's just another place for your kids to stuff things, right? So there's not a real value proposition for actually putting a 27th cup holder in. So some features turn out to be just extra. They're not really meaningfully important, and they don't really add value from the customer's perspective either. The middle curve, the performance line, really describes largely why the customer is trying to buy the service. These are core performance features that drive the customer's decision to use a particular capability. On the top right, maybe I have a broad array of different customers who are going to use this service. Maybe on the bottom left, I have important things, but maybe they're only important for a small niche group of people. And so we want to be able to provide this because we have to take care of this niche of people. Maybe they're, for example, people who are auditing our solution or people who are that we have to demonstrate compliance to, right? But there are not as many of them by any means as there are people on the top right who are going to be focused on the core performance activities. And then the green curve describes what I call basic price of admission features. These are basic capabilities. If I buy a car from you, I kind of expect it to have a steering wheel. I'm not giving you extra credit for that, and I probably wouldn't even consider your car if it didn't have one. Right? But they just kind of describe basic capabilities that are price of admission. I can't really have an offering without them, but they're not going to drive anybody's decision about whether or not I should use your particular capability. So you could take a series of user stories and you could create a map on a whiteboard or something to that extent and ask people to put stories where they go. Are these real hot excitement factors? Are these core performance activities? Are these little nichey things for certain key stakeholders? Are these basic price of admission capabilities? Right, and this then we can use these outputs to inform what our prioritization decisions might need to look like. A very popular one, and one that appears in just about every best practice framework on earth, is called Moscow. Now, Moscow is an acronym, stands for must have, should have, could have, won't have. I disagree a little bit with the way the slide is laid out. They talk about describing like 60% of the capabilities as must have. One of the things I encourage you to do with your clients is to give them a much higher standard here, right? Because most clients are inclined to think that most things are must have. And so one of the things I tell clients is someone going to go to jail if they don't do this? Because there are such things. There are various legal and regulatory compliance rules where a large fine or even a jail term might be your solution if you don't provide certain things. Those are must-have requirements. We literally must have them, or someone's taking me out in handcuffs. All right, so that's probably going to have to be part of any minimum marketable features or any minimum viable product. Right? Most pieces of a solution are should have pieces. Right? The solution should have it, but we might not need 100% of the should haves before we can start extracting real benefits. So maybe some type of minimum viable product line could be drawn after I meet all the must haves and some subset of the should haves. Right? Could haves, solution could have it. Maybe we do it, maybe we don't. Some of the could haves might be those super hot excitement factors, though, we were talking about when we looked at the Canoe model. In which case, in certain circumstances, some could haves might prioritize above some of the should haves. Because if we had it, it would cause competitive differentiation and potentially be a kind of a game changer from a business perspective. And then lastly, of course, we have won't have. This always means won't have for now, because nothing here is written in stone, and all of these things are kind of subject to change as things go along and as people's needs evolve, as legal and regulatory things evolve, and so on. Another common method that people use is cold rice. Like Moscow, rice is also an acronym, right? And here you're trying to assess the broad reach. How many users are there? How many transactions does this support? Loosely, kind of how big and wide a stretch is this capability? What is the impact of this particular opportunity? How does this help improve the quality of service? How does it make it better? How does it make it faster? How does it make it cheaper? What's our level of confidence in being able to demonstrate the value of this? Do we have a high degree of confidence that we have the reach and impact right? Right, that we're pretty sure that if we deliver this capability, it's going to have a big, positive result on our customers' ability to perform. And then last and certainly not least, how hard is this to do? What's the effort involved in making this happen? And ultimately, I could do a back of the napkin calculation around multiplying risks, reach times impact times confidence over effort, right, to use as a prioritization approach. Now, one warning about using quantitative models, right? The risk factor when people start trying to convert these to numbers is that it creates opportunities for people to game the system, right? The more complex the quantitative approach is, quite bluntly, the more gameable it is too. And so people start to lose confidence that the prioritizations really reflect their needs. So I encourage you to make sure that if you're going to use an approach like this, that you make sure that it's easily accessible and that your scales are simple enough that people have a fundamental understanding of how you're making those adjudications so that there aren't arguments that people are putting their thumbs on the scale. All of these are grounded in a broad idea, again, called validated learning. So again, when we begin a project journey, we're trying to figure out what we do and don't know about the solution at hand. Sometimes we have really good quality market information, in which case we don't have to do as much of this, right? We kind of know what the market demand is. We know which things are high priority, and we're going to go do those first. When we don't have good quality information, maybe we have to do some experimentation. So in a validated learning model, I might choose potential features with reasonably high risk, with reasonably poor market visibility, just to be able to get a temperature check on, is this something that we should spend energy on? This is largely an outgrowth of things like lean startup models, right? Do I want to invest resources in this particular option or this particular capability? This is effectively doing a feasibility study. So looking at a particular type of capability, what are the highest value requirements that might drive the use of that capability? Could we do an experiment to try to ascertain whether or not, in fact, people will use it? If we build it, will they come, right? Does this get the buy-in that we need? And how do we then use the data for uptake for the purposes of figuring out next steps? Do we try some other thing? Do we continue down the same path? Do we may need to make adjustments in various ways as we work our way through time? So again, the better the quality of information you have at the beginning, the easier it is to prioritize what we want to go focus on first. When we're in really ambiguous situations where we lack a whole lot of visibility, you kind of have to start somewhere, right? So you pick a place to start, try to ascertain to the best of your ability what you think the highest value pieces of that look like, and start your journey, and then use the feedback loops to determine whether you should continue down that path or try some other approach. Now, generally speaking, we use a value-based approach to establish our backlog, right? So we really want the client to prioritize by value first, right? If I need a tiebreaker, the tiebreaker goes to risk. Now, interestingly, for high value things, we want to take the higher risk parts of that first, right? If it's high value enough, we're going to have to do it. If we're going to have a showstopper issue around a high value piece of the solution, we want to try to find out right now so that if we have to course correct or come up with some other approach, that we can do that in a way that helps minimize the resource investment. So in this circumstance, we want to take the higher risk stuff first. They're all critical value, but we're going to take the high risk ones, try to demonstrate that we can do the risk mitigations we need to deliver those capabilities, and then work our way toward lower risk things. By the time you get down to low value things, maybe we don't do it quite the same way. So if I'm working down toward the bottom of a backlog, maybe toward the end of the project, if something is low value and high risk, maybe we'll just decide to scope it out and focus instead on some lower hanging fruit so we can make sure that we're adding more capabilities, right? So you want to be able to take on higher risk things at the top of your backlog, down kind of at the bottom. Maybe once stuff gets to be low value enough, if it's high risk, maybe we should consider not doing it. Now, a lot of these techniques that I've talked about with you are really hard for clients to get their heads around, right? And so we need to come up with viable ways to coach our people on how to get after this. And so one technique that I'd use that works really, really nicely is a version of storyboarding. And in the way that I do this, I have the client go through a process where they talk about what are all the steps you took from the time you woke up this morning to, let's say, the time you left to go to your office, thinking about pre-COVID universe for just a minute here, right? So what are all the things you did this morning as part of your morning routine to get ready for your day, right? And so you go through kind of all the things you'd like to do or all the things you'd normally do. And then let's say we throw a monkey wrench in there and say, now let's say you overslept and you got 5 minutes. So what survives? Which things do we continue to do given that we only have 5 minutes? And which things don't make the cut? This helps customers start to sharpen their thinking about what is a minimum viable product, right? How much of a solution do I need to do the big stuff, to do the core things that a solution requires? And how much of it, quite frankly, is nice to have, like having some time to talk to your roommate before you leave for work, or nice to have like being able to go to the gym before you go to work, right? And there are lots of things that we'd like to do. What are the things we must do? I have to get up. I have to get dressed. I have to I have to take the dog out before I leave. There's things I must do. And those things need to take precedence in how we prioritize what should come first, second, and third on our project. Now, all of these techniques can be used in workshop settings. And it is my strong recommendation to you that rather than trying to have the poor product owner do this in isolation, that you want to engage the product owner's key stakeholders in this conversation. So the technique that I like to use the best is what we call magic prioritization. And here, you're basically, let's imagine you're doing a user story writing workshop and you've got a pile of 100 stories. And now you want to have the team assist your product owner in prioritizing them. So you make a list. First person picks up a story, puts it on the board. Second person picks up a story and they put it above or below the first story. Third person now has a choice. They can pick up a new story and place it, or they can move one of the stories that's already been placed. And maybe we'll make a mark every time somebody wants to move a story. Okay, and you continue this process. And what you're going to find, if any story gets moved like 3 times, we have some disagreement over how to prioritize that. So we're going to need to pull that aside and kind of talk that out. But if I've got 100 stories, you'd be stunned that you can probably prioritize about 90 of them in 15 to 20 minutes. And at that point, now I've got 10 left over that we need to have a conversation about. And different stakeholders can lobby for where they think it should go in the priority list. And then the product owner can make a final call on where to put it relative to other things. But this does really good things for the product owner because it takes all those stories and kind of takes the onus off of him or her to try to figure out what the prioritization should look like by engaging their people and having their people effectively do it for them. Right. And they'll figure out very quickly which things are really, really, really important and which are just kind of other stuff that may or may not matter very much. It might not ultimately get done because there are higher value things to do. Right. Again, the product owner does and should have final arbitration over the final 10, but I'm not arguing over 100 stories now. I'm arguing over 10 stories. People can make their best pitch. What do they think we should do? And then the product owner can make a final call. Nonetheless, what this allows you to do as a solution provider is to go into your client situation, help them quickly aggregate the different kinds of information that they're going to need from their stakeholders and have them engage in the prioritization activity. You can combine this with some of the other techniques. So maybe I have them organize it by Moscow first, and then we take each one of the sections and we do magic prioritization for that. Or maybe I use Canoe and then I do magic prioritization based on where something fits on the Canoe curve. Okay. So that's a whole lot in about 35 minutes, guys. So a couple things just to think about here as we're getting ready to kind of wrap this stuff up, and then we'll be happy to answer your questions. There are many techniques for this. If you go out and Google, just go look around for different alternative techniques. There are many, many to choose from. It is actually fundamentally less important which technique you choose than that you spend some time learning it and getting pretty good at it. Right? It's also important for your customers too, especially if you're working with the same customer base over and over and over again, because those folks eventually need to learn how to do this. And once you've kind of engaged them and they've learned how to write stories and they've learned a little bit about how the prioritization models work, it will help them help you and your product owners to be able to prioritize things more quickly. This is an enormous value add for your client. Again, in theory, in Scrum, this is all kind of the product owner's responsibility. In practice, virtually every product owner is in desperate trouble, right? And when they start looking at these huge piles of stories, they often lack ability to make informed decisions about the prioritization. So we shouldn't substitute our thinking for it, but we should facilitate and help engage their people to help them help their own product owner. Be willing to try some of them, right? You may find that certain customers respond well to certain models. Some customers really like Moscow. Some customers refuse to let go of the idea that everything's a must have, which case maybe we're going to need to try a different technique to help them try to gain some visibility and gradation into which things are really more important than other things. Like anything else in Agile, right? We should be prepared for adaptation, right? We're going to do the best we can to try to understand the things that we do know, and then we're going to learn. So as you're working with your clients, try some of these techniques, right? Maybe one at a time, right? Get some experience with it, get some feedback from it, learn and adapt, and find out what works well in your practice for your clients. With this, I'm going to turn it back to the facilitator for the session. And I think that the facilitator has a couple more things to share with you, and then I'll be extremely happy to take your questions. Thank you, everybody.